G'day. I hate begging for money, but we've got to ask. We're planning for 2026 and we don't have enough money to keep going with the other side in the form that we've been going in 2025. We need a signal from you that you want the show to continue so that we can plan properly for what we will be able to do in 2026. Please go to othersidetv.com.au and join up to the exclusive side for less than $5 a month. And let us know that you want us to continue. Or if you want to just do it here on YouTube. If you're on YouTube, click the join button next to the subscribe button below, the join button, and that will enable you to support us also for a few dollars every month, just around the price of a cup of coffee. And it sends a signal that we should continue into 2026 and lets us know what we need to do to plan for next year. Thanks a lot for your support. I hope we're back in 2026. We had a national COVID inquiry, you may or may not recall, and it recommended clearer national leadership and a permanent public health agency, an Australian Centre for Disease Control, like the Americans, an ACDC, to coordinate responses if, God forbid, we ever had another pandemic threat. That inquiry said that early responses by our governments across Australia were too fragmented and ad hoc, that there should have been a much more centralised, single, unified approach rather than ad hoc arrangements. But that's a government view, right? And government's answer to problems caused by government tends to always be more government. A more liberal or libertarian view might be to suggest that things were too centralised and government took too much control in an environment where it knew too little and should not have been so quick to try to control the public. In practical terms, the biggest failure and stupid decision was hotel quarantine, according to the inquiry. We asked on this show way back in 2020 why our genius state governments thought it was a good idea to stick people into the equivalent of what is upright stationary cruise ships sharing centralised air conditioning. It seems pretty obvious to anyone that that would be a dumb thing to do if you don't want a virus to spread among any group of people where you reckon one or two might already be carrying it. Not obvious enough for our bureaucrats, though. And now the inquiry tells us the truth. Hotel quarantine failures were linked to major outbreaks. Oh my God. Then we had the economic failures. Schemes like JobKeeper showed the value of rapid support, but also the need for much better design, better targeting and better evaluation afterwards so that emergency payments aren't wasteful and don't set dangerous precedents and become a moral hazard. On the public health front, we had issues with technical capacity for testing, sequencing and data, according to the inquiry. Why weren't early tests done with a random sample of Australians to tell us exactly how much this thing was really spreading in the community? Why were TV news bulletins blaring numbers of people infected with zero context about how many more people were actually getting tested and how much more likely those people getting tested would be to test positive compared with the average citizen? The screeching dumb journalists don't know how to do statistics properly, nor do the dumb politicians we had leading us, and where were the health bureaucrats who are supposed to be scientists? So all of this, the case numbers are going up every day stuff, was just unnecessarily anxiety-inducing. And I think they wanted it that way. And finally, our civil liberties, as if they should be the last thing we consider. The pandemic also underlined the importance of balancing movement restrictions with social and economic harms, the inquiry says. The leading UK medical journal, The Lancet, says that expert reviews have now emphasised the need for proportionality and careful consideration of the unintended costs of blanket measures. But we said all that at the time and we were laughed at, or worse, we were called granny killers by the left. No, actually, it was the leftist arrogance of governments like Victoria's that led to the deaths of people in aged care. Thanks very much. So despite the inquiry, what have we really learned? And what are we doing to make sure these mistakes aren't repeated? Joining me to discuss precisely that on the other side this week as the year draws to an end and we get reflective and pensive, Professor James Allan from the University of Queensland Law School and Professor Gigi Foster from the University of New South Wales Economics School. Gigi, I'll start with you on this topic because you were right in the thick of it at the time, warning people that we were making some pretty obvious mistakes and you were being ignored and criticised for it in some quarters, if I recall correctly. But you were right. Congratulations, you were right.
Thank you. I mean, I wish I'd hear that from more people, but it isn't really something people are comfortable saying. Thank you, sorry, you were right, I was wrong. Maybe we should, read your books. No, that's not something that's happened much. Yeah, I mean, you summarized it well in your intro. I think we were saying so many of these things, and it was so obvious, not just that, we didn't have enough information or we didn't have enough resources. It was actually that we were just blowing those whole things so far out of proportion and ignoring so many things that matter in normal times. And we have therefore created lots of crises that we didn't have previously. I mean, we've talked about the cancers that weren't found during the lockdown period, the mental health problems in the lockdowns. We literally made people less healthy by locking them down. Lockdowns have never been a proven health measure. In fact, I have a paper now, I think a year or two old now, with Sanjeev Sablock and Jay Bhattacharya and Paul Freiders and another one or two people, which is about the failure of quarantines over the history of humanity. And they were known to not work as early as the mid-1900s. In fact, it was the sanitarian movement back then in the UK, which gave rise to the UK Public Health Act in 1848. And that thing is the thing that redirected the focus of public health authorities towards simple measures like hygiene, basically having sewers, having clean water, having cleanliness in general, not too clean, but clean enough. That is also what triggered the increase in human longevity that we see in every graph you've ever seen about human longevity. It starts going up in 1850. So we just were completely misguided. We forgot all of that knowledge. And honestly, I don't think that the move towards the ACDC is the right direction at all. I don't think we've learned anything at the levels of power and authority that matter. And I think, unfortunately, we are just as primed, if of a very nasty thing that we are primed to be scared of rises again. I think we're primed to do, unfortunately, many of the same mistakes.
Okay, so you don't think we've really learned our lesson in the serious sense. James, creating an Australian Centre for Disease Control seems to be the first thing that they've done. The other thing is state governments reworking their quarantine playbooks and paying more attention to things that, I guess, sort of in the line of what Gigi was mentioning, to ventilation, to staffing, to PPE, clearer accountability when using hotels or other facilities. But that process varies by state. That needs a lot of ongoing investment, according to the Hotel Quarantine Review report from the Prime Minister's office. So there's all these. There's that awareness, I guess, that quarantine wasn't the right thing, as Gigi said, in the way that was done. That it would have been better to have other things happening. But I don't get the feeling that they wouldn't just do exactly the same thing again next time, if there is a next time.
Well, it's premised on locking down again and playing around at the margins. Look, they knew before 2020, they had the WHO and Britain had done a study of 100 years, going back to before the First World War, and they knew not to lock down. And that was the playbook based on a century of data. And in 4 weeks, they decided to copy the Communist Politburo of China. And based on nothing except panic. And the excuse you'll get is something like, well, we were uncertain what was happening. But look, no public policy person thinks, or they didn't used to think, it's a good idea. In the face of uncertainty, you don't run to the most brutal, illiberal response you can think of. What you do is you carry on and you try to change things at the margin. We knew from the Diamond Princess that only old people were really at threat. So they knew that in March 2020. That's when Ramesh and I, and then we met Gigi later. There was no data for what they did. And you say, well, they weren't very good with stats. Well, they copied the professor from Imperial College who had gotten BSE wrong, so mad cow disease. He was wrong by orders of magnitude. He got foot and mouth disease wrong. And he comes out with this. So they listened to modelers. They just ignored data and they listened to modelers. Yep. And so this is our problem. And, we have a governor of Queensland who was high up. The public health people discredited themselves. And Gigi's right. You don't expect politicians to say they're sorry until they've left office because it'll affect their career. Now, they should, but they won't. And you have to remember, this was brought to you nationally by a Liberal government. There wasn't a single person who left cabinet saying this was thuggery. There were one or two in Britain who said this is crazy, to Boris Johnson, a supposed libertarian sort of. So the political class failed us. For what it's worth, I will say that there isn't a single instance anywhere in the world where you can point to a Bill of Rights, where the judges use the Bill of Rights to ameliorate any of these regulations. So bills of rights completely worthless. The biggest inroads on our civil liberties in 200-300 years. And they did not.
Daniel Andrews used those emergency laws and just ran roughshod over any of the considerations and safeguards that were existed.
It was a weird combination. We'll go back to Gigi, but it was a weird combination of the press acting like fear-mongering sort of exponents of the most brutal lockdowns ever, and politicians who didn't pay any of the costs. The problem is the people who imposed the rules didn't pay the cost. They got to go to work. They were picked up in chauffeur cars. They got extra power. Life was pretty good for them. They didn't lose their salary. And ironically, for a right-of-center liberal government, the bureaucracy was fine. They got to work from home. Another problem that Gigi will mention, working from home, we can't get out of it now because people feel like it's an entitlement. Australia's productivity is tanking. It's one of the worst in the OECD.
Our biggest economic problem.
I wonder why.
Yep.
Josh Frydenberg was more profligate than any Labour treasurer. Yep. And the problems are myriad. When people pointed this out, it was, we're focused. Oh, there was this great cartoon in the early days where they showed heaven and they had, people lining up for the heart disease and cancer. And then there's this basically empty line for COVID with a red carpet. And we were focused on deaths from COVID, which are all, the way they count it was a lie anyway. So it was like this mental infection.
Well, it was, and it was global. That's the other thing, wasn't it, Gigi? We were pretty bad, but we weren't the worst. There were plenty of places around the world.
Melbourne was amongst the worst cities,
yes.
definitely.
Yes.
But certainly, there are plenty of other Western countries that completely lost their heads. And it was very much a virus that went around the world. And I'll tell you, the people who didn't catch the virus are the people who didn't have televisions, basically who already had their local groups, usually local, or some kind of thematic group that they belonged to and believed and were secure in, and they just didn't get scared. So like the Amish, for example. COVID didn't happen to the Amish, right? Just didn't happen. And it's because they just weren't connected with the rest of the communities around them. And I know the Amish, they're right there in, Pennsylvania, Ohio, the whole area where I grew up. And they just sailed through the whole COVID period. And they did sensible things. They did things that, as James said, we've known for decades, generations, are helpful when you're dealing with an infectious respiratory virus. Things like getting sunshine and having plenty of water and maybe using saltwater gargles and vitamin D supplementation. Of course, we found out many other things too, like ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, proning. Remember proning? I remember that in April 2020. We discovered these things, but the governments around the world, including Australia, suppressed these kinds of early treatments. And that was another one of the egregious ethical failures that we had. Instead of empowering experimentation, innovation at the coalface with people who were seeing what was going on, bureaucrats decided to suppress all of that. And of course, that's where advance comes from, right? It comes from innovation at the coalface. Bureaucrats suppressed that and instead made these judgment calls in areas that they had really no knowledge of. And they were developing one-size-fits-all policies, running roughshod over the local needs that were driving people to try different things. And that's why we didn't hear about a lot of early treatment. In fact, it was illegal to prescribe ivermectin. Some doctors lost their license for doing so.
I'm not even sure we can still say it on YouTube without this video being suppressed.
I think we need to take a second here and congratulate the one country that did do the right thing, which was Sweden.
Yeah.
Sweden.
And Anders Tegnell should get the Nobel Prize for He won't.
100%.
But he just said, I'm looking at the data and I'm following the plan that the WHO in Britain had. And if you look at the last time I looked, Gigi will know the facts more recently, but they have the second lowest excess deaths in Europe per capita. So. Right. So this and they had a good flu season the year before, so there was a lot of dry timber for them. So Sweden, if you compare like with like, came out of it at least as well as anywhere else. Florida, another good example. I mean, DeSantis locked down for about 2 weeks and then actually had the courage to pull out. Nobody else did. Well, he looks better than California. He looks better than New York. And they had a lot of old people in New York.
I don't feel
Florida.
like there's an admission. There's no admission of we got it wrong. We need to do better. We learned and we're sorry. And there's none of that. It's just tweak, tweak, tweak. The third thing is the Treasury. The three things that they're doing. So we talked about creating the Australian CDC. Questionable whether that's going to help centralising decision making even more. I don't know if that's going to help. State governments reworking their quarantine playbooks. Well, if they hadn't changed them in the first place, they would have been fine the way they were. The original playbooks were actually right. the crisis management manuals, is they tossed them out and followed China, as you said.
Based on 4 weeks of no data and models.
Well, yeah.
It's
And then the
crazy.
third thing they're doing, the only thing that they seem to be doing is the Treasury Department's refining rapid economic response mechanisms and reviewing things like JobKeeper so that future ones can be quicker, more targeted and auditable. They won't be, they probably, the cost though will still be there. We'll still be paying for it 5 years later like we are now. I don't really see anything there that's really, significant change of mindset or deals with the actual problems that we had of. One of the things that shocked me the most, Gigi, and I'm an MBA, I've got no medical background. I come from a bit of a medical family, but I don't have any background really in medicine. I studied statistics. As a journalist, I was looking at journalism is trash in this country, but I was looking at the nightly news and seeing these numbers, COVID cases going up today with absolutely zero context whatsoever.
Nothing.
Obviously, if you're taking a sample of people who are moving towards you to go and get tested, they're already people who have self-selected as potentially ill, right? So firstly, you've got a skewed sample. Secondly, so there's no randomness. So where was the random sampling? Where was we'll take 1,000 test kits out and do a random sample so we know exactly the penetration? That is Science 101. How could how did that not happen?
Look,
I never understood.
Just because of the fear. Again, it's the fear that was the initial, that's why we called our book The Great COVID Panic, right? Because the panic aspect was the thing that catapulted us into this absolute insanity. And it was the political imperative that developed from the fear that the populations had that then propelled us into the stupidity of various policies we've been discussing for 2.5 years. We're still on it, actually. The ACDC is another insane policy. So it really is emotionally driven. It's just that when people are petrified of something, everything goes out the window. And that's why I say we're primed for having the same response, because if we get scared again, we'll have the same response. And the people who never got that priming, that petrification priming, like the Amish, they just didn't have a problem. And so, and the reason why we're not going to see a real admission that, oh yeah, we got these things seriously wrong, is because the problem's too big. I mean, it's just too big of a mistake. It's like the too big to fail argument, but in the case of essentially political status and reputation. I think that there is a genuine worry by the people who were in charge at the time and those who are still in our parties, our political parties here, that if they were to admit the scale of their mistakes during the COVID era and the scale of the damage that they've done to this country, they may destabilize the very country itself.
Well, or they would face personal legal risk, right?
And Gigi, the fear didn't just grow up by itself. The press and the government encouraged the fear.
Yeah.
And they made stuff up. Like there was no evidence for this, the 6-foot rule. They just plucked that out of thin air. And masks, there's still to this day, there's almost zero evidence that masks work, but it's a nice way to make people feel like, they're protecting themselves. It was a coordinated, and we know this from the Telegraph Twitter files of Hancock, that they were just trying to scare people because they didn't know what to do. And
but yes, if you separate people, if you reduce obviously that's going to work to some extent. The question is
No, I don't think it's going to work at all with a virus. It's just, it's going to get around.
Well, spit.
I mean, So the question is really, what can you do? And again, if I go back to the sanitarians, the main issue that they addressed is the load of the pathogens. So bacterial viral load. When you clean things, you reduce the load. You don't take it to zero, but you reduce the load. So in that sense, yes, it's safer probably for you to visit with your grandmother outside than inside if you are sneezing all over her. It's probably safer. Right, yeah. Probably gonna, you basically just want to lower the load, but you also have to be giving her vitamin D supplementations, giving her saltwater nasal sprays. By the way, a vaccine intramuscularly is never going to protect against a nasally acquired, respiratory infection, right? That's just never going to happen anyway. So, there are things we can practically do to just
why not, Gigi? Why would that not help?
Because it's going into your bloodstream. It's going into a part of your body.
But that's connected to your immune system. That's connected.
The initial attack happens in your nose. So you want to kill the stuff in your nose if you can.
I see. Okay. All right. You're talking about the initial attack.
That's the first place that it goes. Only if it goes into your, further. If you basically don't have that healthy immunity, like if you're young and healthy, you're going to probably just, get rid of the infection before it even makes you sick.
So here's something that bugs me. The entire focus is on let's lower deaths by COVID. Nobody says there's a lot of grandparents who want to see their grandkids and they don't care. literally don't care if it gets them an extra 2 months of living. They don't want to die by themselves in a hotel.
No.
People were taking the choice away from people
Yep.
and putting it with bureaucrats.
Yep.
They didn't bear any of the costs. So, and the civil liberties infringements were huge. And again, nobody seemed to care. And going back to the economy, I'm a conservative. It was the biggest wealth transfer from poor to rich.
Yep.
And from young to old, because it was massive money printing and asset inflation. And who has assets? Well, you do, Damien, and I do. We've got houses, but young kids. So we got this massive hit of wealth. So no wonder young people are mad. So it was the best 2 years ever to be a billionaire. It was infuriating on every level, and the costs are there everywhere. And it's very.
And the young paid the biggest cost, the biggest price, not just economically,
we were
but
below
socially.
Kazakhstan before the lockdowns, and now nobody wants to talk about how bad Australian educational results are.
No, they're
Yeah,
terrible.
They're
I
terrible.
totally agree. And by the way, I have to give a plug for the Australians for Science and Freedom Conference this weekend. We have
Yes.
a huge focus on education, exactly because of what James is saying. We've seen major problems from K through university. So we'll be talking about how to reform Australia's education systems and the systems in the West more generally.
Okay, so join us at the Australians for Science and Freedom Conference in Sydney this weekend, if you can. I think late tickets are still available, so please get onto that. I'll be speaking. Gigi obviously will be there, so lots going on there. Gigi, thanks very much. We're going to come back in a moment, have a little bit more talk about some other news. Stay with us. A great way to support the other side is to support our sponsors like SmartKits Australia, the best supplier of do-it-yourself prefab home renovation kits. And it's not just carports. SmartKits do decks, patios and pergolas, flyover roofs and insulated roofing too. All prefabricated, fully engineered and delivered anywhere in Australia. And if you're not too handy, they'll install it for you too. Get onto it. smartkits.com.au. That was a segment clip from our weekly Friday night news show, The Other Side, which you can watch in full by simply going to YouTube and searching up The Other Side Australia. Then you'll find our full shows playlist. You can also find all of our full shows and our segments on our own website, othersidetv.com.au. That's othersidetv.com.au. Help us build a whole new Aussie media by joining us over there and signing up for the exclusive side.